I wish to commence by formally expressing my gratitude to the presiding chairman for granting me the opportunity to provide my testimony today. Although I feel entirely compelled to note for the permanent record that during the most recent the occasion when millions of his own constituents desperately required his presence and leadership, he was reportedly situated at a luxury resort in a tropical destination. Therefore, I genuinely appreciate the fact that he has chosen to be physically present in this chamber this morning, as that undeniably represents a notable improvement. The gathered assembly within the grand hearing room erupted into a chorus of audible amusement before she had even managed to completely settle into her designated leather chair. This specific, highly calculated method of commanding a room is precisely what the representative does. She arrives at a Bose congressional proceeding with the exact same intense focus and strategic awareness that a seasoned soldier brings to a chaotic battlefield. She had already meticulously scouted the complex environment, ensuring her digital devices were open and prepared, verifying that her dedicated supporting staff members were positioned with absolute precision, exactly 2 rows behind her, and ensuring the very first highly shareable digital moment was already perfectly framed within her mind, before the initial syllable even departed from her lips. She has been flawlessly executing this exact communicative strategy since her earliest days in public office. She intuitively understands precisely how the sound of laughter resonates within these acoustic spaces. She knows exactly which broadcasting camera serves as the primary media feed for the major networks. She fundamentally grasps the modern political reality that a perfectly curated 30-second exchange holds immensely more political capital than a comprehensive 90-minute policy discussion. And she has remarkably never, throughout her extensive and highly scrutinized tenure, departed from a space exactly like this without definitively securing the most advantageous and memorable interaction. The distinguished senator from the opposing political faction, acting in his capacity as chairman, was seated approximately 12 feet away, at the elevated panel table quietly transcribing notes into a notably thin folder, and he purposefully chose not to lift his gaze to meet hers. The gathering was a routine session of the Legislative Committee focused on international commerce and foreign economic strategy, representing the exact sort of moderately prioritized, procedurally dense proceeding that typically occupies a modest number of attendees and only generates widespread public attention when an unexpected controversy materializes. The senator presided over this specific committee, and the representative had been formally invited to serve as an expert witness, articulating her political faction's perspective concerning international trade partnerships, an invitation she had accepted with absolute and immediate enthusiasm. She invariably accepted such invitations because these specific proceedings prominently featured broadcasting equipment, and within any environment equipped with visual recording technology, she had never once departed without having successfully orchestrated at least a singular moment of profound narrative significance that would dominate the evening news cycle. She cast another fleeting, calculating glance in his direction as she meticulously organized her extensive reference materials, mentally noting his impeccably tailored dark suit and the remarkably slender appearance of the document folder resting quietly before him. She astutely registered that specific detail. This was absolutely not the voluminous, heavily documented binder typically associated with a sudden political ambush, but rather a remarkably concise collection of pages, indicating to her experienced eye that he was either perilously unprepared for the magnitude of the impending engagement, or, conversely, and much more dangerously, that he had prepared with such devastating quiet thoroughness that extensive reference materials were rendered entirely unnecessary. She had dedicated years of her professional career to carefully observing seasoned political adversaries seated across from her in imposing chambers exactly like this one. She had long ago concluded that the truly formidable opponents were rarely the individuals who projected the most volume or manufactured the most outrage. Instead, the most terrifyingly formidable figures were consistently those who arrived well before the scheduled commencement, seated themselves in profound silence, and methodically documented their thoughts while their opponents were still awkwardly engaged in the chaotic process of getting physically settled. She deliberately archived that perceptive observation deep within her mind, and the very instant the glowing broadcasting indicators signaled that the session was transmitting live to the nation. She allowed that thought to vanish from her immediate consciousness, to comprehensively comprehend the devastating sequence of events that was about to unfold, and to fully understand precisely why a standard legislative committee session transformed within a matter of mere hours into the most intensely scrutinized and fiercely debated political broadcast of the entire legislative season. One must fundamentally grasp a critical underlying reality regarding both of these powerful public figures, a complex reality that the predictably polarized media ecosystem would deliberately neglect to articulate to the public. The initial reality that must be comprehensively acknowledged is that this representative is, by any objective and honest metric of evaluation, a genuinely extraordinary individual whose life trajectory defies all conventional probability. She evacuated her war-torn homeland as a remarkably the young child alongside her, desperately fleeing family during a period of devastating civil unrest, resided for several formative years within the harsh confines of a neighboring refugee encampment, eventually arrived in her newly adopted nation at a remarkably young age, possessing absolutely no functional fluency in the predominant local language. She tenaciously acquired linguistic proficiency by diligently studying television broadcasts, successfully attained her citizenship before reaching the age of majority, and subsequently ascended to become a historic pioneer within the national legislative body, representing a multitude of profound demographic firsts that fundamentally reshaped the historical composition of the institution. That particular sequence of staggering achievements does not merely constitute a professional resume. Rather, it represents a profoundly transformative, almost mythic, lived experience. She intentionally constructed her entire public and political identity around that specific, undeniable life narrative, anchoring her core philosophy on the profound conviction that an individual who had successfully navigated such extraordinary adversity, who originated from such deeply marginalized circumstances, who authentically represented communities that shared her visual identity, her spiritual practices, and her ancestral legacy of displacement and enduring hardship. That specific individual possessed an unparalleled, almost sacred obligation to fiercely articulate uncomfortable truths within the gilded corridors of power, where such truths were historically unwelcome. She had been fulfilling that self-appointed mandate with immense unapologetic volume and an absolute absence of contrition for her entire tenure. She had been subjected to every conceivable form of verbal hostility, rigorously investigated for numerous alleged infractions, and targeted by aggressive communications of such a severe nature that federal protective measures were deemed entirely necessary for her physical survival. She had endured the deeply unsettling experience of having organized crowds chant exclusionary slogans, directed at her very right to exist within the country, witnessed her deeply held spiritual beliefs deliberately weaponized as supposed evidence of national disloyalty, and watched unfounded speculations regarding her private life gleefully disseminated by media, platforms that were fully aware of the unsubstantiated nature of the claims, yet chose to publish them regardless. She had successfully navigated a deeply controversial, highly partisan procedural removal from a highly influential committee, the very committee that governed the international policies. she valued most profoundly during a profoundly polarized legislative vote, while she stood resiliently on the central deliberative floor and delivered an oratorical response that even her most skeptical colleagues quietly acknowledged as one of the most remarkably dignified displays of resilience they had witnessed in recent institutional memory. She was definitively not an individual who fractured under pressure, and she was certainly not someone who could be psychologically dismantled. By the standard interrogatory pressures of a routine committee proceeding, she had successfully absorbed significantly more devastating challenges than anything her adversary could possibly possess within that slender portfolio, and she had consistently emerged from the other side of those crucibles, carrying her fundamental convictions completely intact. However, she had also, throughout her extensive period of highly visible public service, accumulated a comprehensive, undeniable, documented history and an objective public record is fundamentally unalterably distinct from a curated personal narrative. A narrative is a flexible construct that an individual maintains the capacity, control, and shape, whereas a public record inherently belongs to history accessible to any citizen. Possessing access to legislative archives, public tracking databases, and the verbatim transcripts of community fundraising engagements conducted in previous years. The secondary reality that requires incredibly thorough comprehension concerns the character, background, and intellect of the presiding chairman himself, not the heavily caricatured, easily mocked version that proliferated endlessly across partisan digital platforms and aggressive fundraising communications. The widely recognized caricature of the politician who departed his freezing state during a devastating crisis. The official who once utilized intensely critical language against the party's eventual leader, only to later transition into his most reliable institutional supporter. The individual who served as the primary manifestation of everything his ideological opponents believed was deeply flawed within the 12-day opposing political faction. That specific version of the man was undeniably useful for political mobilization. That constructed persona effectively generated massive financial contributions, energized deeply committed voting blocs, and provided the oppositional media ecosystem with a highly visible, incredibly convenient antagonist whose perceived moral shortcomings were remarkably straightforward to catalog, mock, and broadcast. However, the authentic underlying version of the man sitting behind that desk was significantly more complicated, vastly more intelligent, and considerably more terrifying to strategically counter. This individual had graduated with exceptional academic distinction from a tremendously prestigious academic institution, where he had remarkably secured the absolute highest national honors in competitive collegiate debate. Dismantling opponents with cold, terrifying logic, he subsequently attended one of the most rigorous legal academies in the nation, graduated with elevated honors, served in a senior editorial capacity on the institution's primary legal journal, and ultimately secured a highly coveted clerkship with the highest judicial authority in the entire land. He subsequently served as the chief appellate advocate for a massive populous jurisdiction for half a decade, personally arguing numerous incredibly complex, historically significant cases before the supreme judicial body, filing dozens of comprehensive legal briefs and ultimately establishing an unassailable professional reputation as one of the most technically precise, relentlessly logical, and intellectually formidable appellate litigators practicing within the entirety of the national legal profession. None of those remarkable professional credentials inherently validated his moral character, nor did they somehow magically resolve the deeply lingering valid public questions regarding his controversial personal travel decisions during a deadly crisis. His contentious legislative maneuvers regarding infrastructure funding, or his extended history of calculated political flexibility, toward a prominent figure he had previously assessed with. Harsh, unflinching accuracy he had undeniably made. Deliberate, calculated, strategic choices that highly reasonable and deeply ethical individuals could intensely condemn, and he would be forced to navigate the historical consequences of those specific decisions for the rest of his life. Nevertheless, the vital realization was this: he was not merely a former collegiate debater who had stumbled into the realm of public administration. He was a highly trained, deeply experienced, ruthlessly effective courtroom litigator who had entered the political arena carrying the single most devastating capability that exists within any adversarial environment. He possessed the refined, almost artistic ability to construct a line of inquiry, so exceptionally precise, built so methodically from establishing foundational evidence step by step toward an inevitable conclusion, that the opposing party can vividly perceive the approaching consequence, but remains entirely powerless to halt it. In such terrifying instances, the carefully constructed question itself essentially transforms into the definitive verdict before the respondent has even been granted the opportunity to articulate a single word of defense. He required only a remarkably thin folder for this engagement. He had purposefully brought a notably thin folder, and he had already quietly opened it to the very first page. I feel it is also vital to formally acknowledge the representative continued smoothly transitioning into the carefully modulated communicative cadence she had diligently practiced during her transportation to the venue, a dependable rhythm that had successfully carried her through countless similar high-pressure engagements over the years that our committee is convening today during a critical temporal juncture, when our nation is projecting a geopolitical strategy that is according to the protected, deeply considered assessments of the most highly respected international analysts, becoming increasingly fragmented and fundamentally incoherent. Furthermore, I am more than slightly struck by the profound irony inherent in the reality that the distinguished chairman of this very committee, which claims institutional jurisdiction over our crucial international relationships, was reportedly enjoying recreational travel overseas to view ancient ruins this past summer, while an overwhelming number of his own citizens, tragically, including vulnerable young people attending recreational programs, were facing catastrophic environmental emergencies. She deliberately paused for the exact perfectly calculated duration of time that extensive public speaking experience teaches a seasoned professional to pause for maximum emotional and dramatic impact. I bring this deeply troubling matter to the forefront of our discussion not out of the desire to excessively analyze past events, but fundamentally because I firmly believe it speaks directly to the core philosophical concept of professional presence, of what it truly means to fulfill the basic sacred obligation of showing up for the very citizens who entrusted you with the profound responsibility of serving in this distinguished building. Consequently, I believe that fundamental question is profoundly worth keeping at the professional port, absolute forefront of our collective consideration, as we discuss today the critical preservation of our nation's international credibility. A wave of supportive, enthusiastic applause cascaded from the aligned members situated within the chamber, accompanied by the subtle, synchronized movements of younger staff members positioned in the rear rows, discreetly recording on their mobile devices. The chairman silently inscribed another line of text into his open folder without ever elevating his line of sight. She felt the momentum building as she carefully transitioned toward the third and most potent strategic rhetorical maneuver. She had prepared the specific devastating statement she had constructed with the utmost linguistic precision. She had verbally tested this exact phrasing with her senior strategic advisor during their transit to the complex, and the advisor had confidently affirmed its potency, assuring her that it was precisely the soundbite that the media ecosystem would ultimately preserve and amplify. She maintained profound trust in that professional instinct. Through years of navigating these precise environments, she had absorbed the vital lesson that the third sequential critique, when architected with optimal rhetorical balance, was invariably the singular moment that the collective memory of the room retained. She pivoted her physical orientation, not toward the broadcasting lenses, nor toward the broader administrative dais, but directly, intensely, and exclusively toward the chairman himself. It was the signature physical gesture she had utilized to build her formidable reputation. A direct, profoundly unafraid, unblinking gaze that silently communicated the unmistakable message that she perceived his authentic nature with absolute clarity, and the reality of what she perceived did not intimidate her in the slightest. When the chairman of this committee was specifically queried several years ago, during the period when he was actively competing for his party's highest national nomination, regarding his unvarnished opinion of his primary political competitor, he publicly described him, and I am reading directly from the verified historical transcript of his own remarks, as a profoundly habitual fabricator of the truth, a deeply self-interested narcissist, and someone entirely lacking in fundamental moral fortitude. Those were his exact, deliberately chosen words, representing his supposedly authentic assessment, securely logged within the public historical record. She inhaled a perfectly measured breath to sustain the dramatic tension. Deliberately mention this historical reality because we find ourselves convening today within a legislative body guided by the very same individual who initially articulated that damning assessment, yet who has subsequently transformed, according to virtually every objective observation, into that exact same leader's most remarkably dependable and unquestioning instrument within the upper chamber of our national legislature. I find that progression to be a truly fascinating analytical data point, when our stated purpose today is to deeply evaluate the conceptual framework of our national credibility and what it authentically means to maintain a steadfast commitment to foundational principles. The surrounding chamber responded with a layer of appreciative laughter that was significantly more robust and sustained than the initial reaction. An individual positioned near the heavy oak rear exits offered a solitary emphatic clap of approval. Her digital communications team had already successfully isolated, trimmed, and posted the high-definition broadcast clip before she even commenced articulating her subsequent sentence. The accompanying digital caption confidently proclaimed that she had not come to play games. Within a matter of mere minutes, the digital artifact would accumulate tens of thousands of views. By the time the afternoon concluded, that metric would expand into the millions, and as evening approached, it would undoubtedly cement its status as the absolute premier political broadcast moment across every major platform. Thoroughly amplified by influential accounts possessing vast audiences and continuously looped on prominent news programs, accompanied by striking on-screen text declaring that the representative had entirely dismantled the senator at his own hearing. She permitted herself a fleeting, carefully concealed moment of deep internal satisfaction, experiencing the quiet vindication of a highly skilled professional who has executed a complex strategic plan correctly. The chairman elevated his gaze from his slender folder for exactly one precisely measured second. He regarded her with an intensely focused expression that was definitively devoid of anger, entirely absent of amusement, and remarkably lacked any of the standard emotional categories she had mentally prepared herself to encounter. Subsequently, he gracefully lowered his line of sight back toward his documents and methodically inscribed one additional sequence of words. When the established, procedural rules eventually recognized his formal right to speak. Nearly 22 minutes later, the chairman deliberately placed his writing instrument upon the desk. positioned both of his hands perfectly flat against the polished wooden surface, and projected his voice into the chamber. "I wish to extend my formal gratitude to you, Congresswoman, for dedicating your valuable time to participate in this committee's essential proceedings." Today, he began, his voice devoid of any defensive tremor. "I also genuinely wish to express my appreciation to you for proactively raising the untentuita deeply serious matters concerning my previous international travel choices and the devastating flooding in my home region. As you highlighted so prominently during your introductory remarks, you are entirely correct in your fundamental assertion that both of those deeply troubling occurrences undeniably necessitate a serious answer, and it is my absolute intention to provide you with exactly that. Before we are done here today, not a strategic deflection, but an answer." His vocal tone was unmistakably the highly controlled, profoundly grounded voice of a professional who had comprehensively predetermined, long before he had even crossed the threshold of the chamber, the precise direction and the exact chronological sequence that this conversation was going to follow. He possessed the absolute unyielding discipline to ensure he would not be diverted from that established trajectory by any amount of ambient laughter, supportive applause, or the unique, intoxicating electricity that traditionally fills a room when one person is performing exceptionally well. He had been in rooms exactly like this before, not merely as an elected official, but as a seasoned lawyer navigating hostile environments where the opposing side seemingly controlled the emotional energy, where the audible amusement favored their arguments, where the pacing belonged to their strategy, and where the broadcasting cameras were pointed entirely in their direction. He had learned in those intense professional crucibles that ambient energy is definitively not a factual argument. He understood deeply that an entire room can be collectively laughing and still remain entirely factually wrong. He knew that a comprehensively constructed sequence of inquiries inherently executes its intended function on its own inevitable schedule, completely independent of the immediate emotional temperature radiating within the room. He calmly opened the covers of his folder. "You have consistently identified yourself, both within this specific hearing and across numerous highly publicized statements, as a profoundly vital and authoritative voice regarding our nation's international foreign policy, particularly concerning our engagements in the Middle East. You have spoken quite extensively about the fundamental concept of American credibility abroad. You purposefully utilized that exact phrase 3 distinct times within the parameters of your opening statement alone. Therefore, I want to start right there with the concept of credibility, with what it fundamentally requires to state something publicly, and subsequently expect the global community to process those statements with absolute seriousness." He focused his gaze upon her with an unwavering, deeply steady intensity. "Several years ago, during a prominently scheduled community fundraising event conducted in a major coastal city, you delivered a sextile, comprehensive public address. I possess the verified transcript of those remarks. Within that address, you stated the following, and I am choosing to read this text verbatim because maintaining absolute factual precision is incredibly important to this inquiry. You stated that the specific advocacy, the organization hosting the event, was originally established in the immediate aftermath of the tragic September attacks, because they critically recognized that some people did something and that, consequently, all of us were starting to systematically lose access to our civil liberties." He gently placed the printed transcript back onto the table. "I possess 2 highly specific, purely factual questions regarding that single, solitary sentence." He smoothly elevated one finger to visually punctuate his point. "First, historical record definitively demonstrates that the advocacy organization in question was formally established approximately 7 years prior to that catastrophic historical event. That foundational chronological fact is a matter of verifiable public record, easily accessible within mere seconds by anyone utilizing the digital devices currently present in this room. When you publicly declared to your audience that this organization was founded after those attacks, that assertion was completely and demonstrably factually incorrect. My inquiry is exceedingly simple. Was that specific articulation a genuine mistake that you have subsequently taken the necessary measures to correct? Or were you simply completely unaware of the organization's authentic, historical timeline? He methodically elevated a second finger, maintaining his measured, deliberate, unstoppable pacing. Second, regarding your specific phrasing that some people did something, I want to respectfully read a selection of specific pacing, names into the permanent record. Betty was a dedicated aviation professional, working aboard one of the initial impacted aircraft. She remarkably maintained an open communication line for nearly half an hour during the crisis, displaying extraordinary composure while relaying critical tactical information to ground authorities that ultimately allowed investigative teams to accurately reconstruct the precise timeline of the catastrophe before the plane hit the structure. Father Michael was a devoted spiritual leader and an official chaplain serving the municipal emergency response departments. He tragically died inside the compromised structure while selflessly administering final spiritual comforts to a fallen firefighter, ultimately being recorded as the very first officially certified casualty of the catastrophic attack. Wells was a remarkably young financial professional operating near the highest elevations of the second impacted structure. During the chaos, he heroically assisted in carrying numerous severely wounded individuals down countless flights of compromised stairwells before the building ultimately suffered a catastrophic collapse. His body was later discovered, respectfully positioned alongside 3 emergency response professionals whom he was actively attempting to help. The atmosphere within the expansive chamber descended into a profoundly heavy, deeply respectful, suffocating stillness. The earlier amusement had completely evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of history. Those remarkable individuals represent merely 3 of the nearly 3,000 entirely innocent people who were brutally killed. That morning, he said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, they were definitively not some people. What happened to them was definitively not something. They were intentionally targeted and killed by an organized extremist network during a deliberately coordinated, massively destructive international terrorist attack that was meticulously planned over Precision ITA, a period of years, and violently executed by 19 men who radically believed they were acting in the name of a religion that the overwhelming vast majority of the world's peaceful global community unequivocally, including I, believe yourself completely and utterly rejects. He directed his intense focus directly toward her once more, the trap fully springing shut. You were delivering those remarks at a significant organizational fundraising gathering. You were intentionally speaking to an assembled audience that intimately included many citizens who were themselves profoundly traumatized by the horrors of that day, and who had themselves tragically faced highly unjust discrimination and unwarranted violence in its deeply complicated societal aftermath. I assure you that I thoroughly understand the context. I completely understand the underlying reasons why you were present at that specific venue and what you were trying to articulate. However, Congresswoman, you occupy a highly elevated position as a constitutionally elected member of the United States House of Representatives. You inherently speak with the formidable authority of an entire congressional district. When you publicly decide to describe the single worst terrorist attack in our modern promotion, national history, with the deeply minimized phrasing of "some people did something," and you choose to do so in public, placing those exact words onto the permanent record. What precisely do you anticipate the grieving families of Betty, Father Michael, and Wells are supposed to logically conclude from that incredibly reductive characterization? He waited, allowing the immense weight of the inquiry to fully settle across the quiet chamber. I would respectfully like you to answer that question specifically. I am not asking for a generalized philosophical discussion regarding the broader context of ideological discrimination, which I readily acknowledge is a profoundly real and deeply serious issue, but rather about those exact, specific words applied directly to those specific human beings. What would you say directly to them? She formulated and delivered her response. She was undeniably exceptional at executing this exact professional requirement. She possessed a genuinely extraordinary, highly refined capability to gracefully navigate hostile interrogations within deeply adversarial environments. Her comprehensive answer was profoundly substantive. She thoroughly elaborated upon the vital historical context regarding the deeply unfortunate wave of unwarranted suspicion directed against specific minority communities. In the prolonged aftermath of the tragedy, she detailed the complex systemic ways in which the catastrophic event had been politically weaponized to justify controversial domestic surveillance initiatives and implement civil liberty, violations that disproportionately affected entirely innocent people. She eloquently described the profound intellectual and emotional complexity inherent in attempting to publicly discuss communal trauma without inadvertently appearing to minimize it. It was, by any objective standard, the highly sophisticated response of an individual who had dedicated significant analytical thought to these profoundly weighty issues, and who held deeply genuine, highly considered personal convictions regarding their importance. The chairman listened to the entirety of her complex explanation with absolute unbroken attention without moving a single muscle. Then, he smoothly reached back into his slender portfolio and produced a second page. Then I want to move to the early months of that same year, occurring chronologically before the fundraising speech we just discussed. The chairman stated smoothly, deliberately reaching into his slender folder and producing a second, printed page. During that period, you responded to a digital discussion regarding legislative support for a specific allied nation by utilizing a highly recognizable colloquial phrase, strongly implying that the underlying motivation of that alliance was exclusively financial. When a journalist subsequently asked you to clarify your meaning, specifically asking you to identify who was paying, whom you explicitly named a prominent political advocacy organization, he set the page down, smoothing it with his fingertips. You later issued a formal apology. I have noted that, and I maintain a policy of taking it seriously. When public figures apologize and demonstrate a commitment to improving their discourse. Therefore, I am not here to relitigate the nuances of the apology itself. However, I want to tell you something highly specific, primarily because you have deliberately positioned yourself for years as a credible, authoritative voice on our foreign policy in that highly sensitive region. You have enthusiastically given interviews to international press conglomerates. You have met with foreign diplomats. You have made sweeping statements about American strategy that have been reported globally. The dual loyalty trope, the deeply offensive suggestion that minority citizens who express support for this allied nation secretly harbor a stronger allegiance to a foreign power than to their own sovereign country, is widely recognized as one of the oldest, most historically devastating and profoundly dangerous discriminatory canards in Western history. It was systematically used across continents for centuries to justify severe persecution. It fundamentally contributed to the horrific societal conditions that ultimately made unparalleled historical atrocities possible. He looked at her with an unwavering, terrifying steadiness. When you actively chose to broadcast that phrase regarding financial motivations and subsequently identified that particular advocacy group as the primary source of the EBI, money, and I wish to be exceptionally precise here, as I am not, asserting that you consciously intended to invoke that horrific history. But when those specific words were released under your authority, what exactly do you believe the citizens of our nation who possess a deep, painful understanding of that terrifying history actually heard? Furthermore, you have dedicated your entire legislative career to aggressively criticizing what you call the corrupting influence of concentrated wealth upon our political system. Do you consistently apply that exact same intense, critical standard to every single lobbying organization, massive corporate donor class? Or does this highly specific form of financial criticism seem to materialize most prominently within your public communications, primarily when the subject is this particular allied nation? A subtle, nearly imperceptible shift rippled through the atmosphere of the chamber, not a shift indicating aggressive opposition toward her, nor demonstrating sudden profound support for him, but a manifestation of something considerably more intellectually uncomfortable. It was the specific, unavoidable shift in collective energy that occurs when an incredibly difficult question is presented with such logical fairness that absolutely no objective observer in the room can comfortably dismiss its validity. She responded once more to the challenge. She remained incredibly capable, her intellectual sharpness undiminished, powerfully articulating the deeply complex argument that issuing robust political criticism regarding the one-site, specific governmental policies of an allied nation does not inherently equate to expressing prejudiced hostility. She argued forcefully that advocacy groups are registered political entities seeking legislative outcomes and therefore represent entirely legitimate subjects for intense political scrutiny. The chairman offered a single brief nod of acknowledgement. I would now like to transition our focus toward the historical tragedy involving the systematic eradication of a massive minority population by a former global empire during the early decades of the previous century. The acoustic quality of the silence within the room immediately transformed, adopting a uniquely tense, deeply anticipatory frequency. During the late autumn several years ago, this legislative body formally considered a specific solemn resolution designed to provide official historical recognition regarding the systematic destruction and tragic loss of approximately 1.5 million individuals. The final tabulation of that specific legislative procedure resulted in an overwhelming, historically rare bipartisan majority of over 400 representatives voting forcefully in the affirmative. A minuscule fraction voted in opposition, and exactly one single representative chose to register their vote simply as present. He focused his attention directly upon her. That singular, highly unusual abstention belonged entirely to you. You deliberately chose to serve as the absolute only member of this entire chamber who actively decided to vote merely present regarding the formal recognition of this monumental historical tragedy. You were not actively opposed to the measure. You simply registered your presence during a profoundly unified moment where virtually the entirety of your colleagues found a moral consensus to say yes. You subsequently offered a highly publicized explanation for your decision, articulating your philosophical belief that the profound moral weight of acknowledging mass historical atrocities should never be crassly weaponized as a cynical political instrument. You passionately argued that the scope of such historical recognition must be drastically expanded to comprehensively include other devastating historical crimes. He allowed the weight of her previous explanation to hang in the air. That represents a completely coherent, intellectually consistent philosophical position. While I personally disagree with it, as I firmly believe that intentionally withholding an affirmative vote regarding the undeniable recognition of a massive historical crime essentially functions practically as a negative vote. I can, nonetheless, fully comprehend the stated intellectual architecture of your logic. What I entirely fail to comprehend, however, is the following deeply troubling contradiction. He slowly turned to a fresh page within his impeccably organized folder throughout the roughly 18-month period. Immediately following that highly controversial procedural decision, you proactively utilized that exact same, profoundly sensitive terminology. The specific terminology denoting the ultimate crime of systematic demographic destruction to publicly characterize the deeply complex security situation occurring in a current, actively ongoing geopolitical conflict on no fewer than 11 distinct heavily publicized occasions. Crucially, you did not utilize this terminology within the context of drawing careful historical comparisons, nor did you include any of your previously demanded philosophical caveats regarding the necessity for a broader framework of global created accountability. On 11 separate occasions, you applied this ultimate categorization directly, forcefully, and without any stated qualification to an immediate military conflict. He carefully placed the printed documentation back onto the desk surface. Let me be abundantly clear. My purpose here today is absolutely not to initiate a protracted debate regarding whether your specific characterization of that extraordinarily complex conflict is factually accurate. That represents an entirely separate conversation. The core focus of my inquiry today is entirely centered upon the fundamental concept of professional consistency. When this entire legislative chamber convened to solemnly vote on the verified eradication of over 1 million individuals, you deliberately chose to vote merely present, stating that such profound terminology must never be politically weaponized. Yet, when you subsequently decided that you needed to make a highly visible political point regarding our current geopolitical strategies, you repeatedly and entirely without hesitation deployed that exact same profoundly sensitive terminology on over a dozen occasions to describe an active conflict, where the fundamental facts on the ground are actively disputed by highly serious analysts representing multiple perspectives. Therefore, my fundamental question mirrors the inquiry I presented earlier. Is your stated requirement for comprehensive historical context an actual deeply held philosophical principle, or is it merely a convenient rhetorical instrument that you tactically deploy when it strategically shields you from difficult votes only to swiftly abandon it the moment it no longer serves your immediate partisan objectives? He observed her with a remarkable quality of patience that possessed neither warmth nor hostility. It was merely an infinite, unyielding stillness. It was the precise, terrifying patience of a skilled interrogator who has meticulously constructed a logical trap so completely inescapable that it absolutely does not require a compelling answer to inflict its intended narrative damage. The devastating impact is achieved entirely through the deafening silence of an inadequate response. Because if it truly represents a foundational principle, he elaborated softly, then you selectively applied that absolute standard to historical victims while entirely failing to apply it during your recent public commentary. Conversely, if it is, demonstrably, not a genuine principle, and you merely utilize the profound gravity of that word when it advantages your arguments while actively withholding it, when it proves politically complicated, then I am forced to deeply wonder what other critical daughters, components of your vaunted foreign policy vocabulary, operate under that exact same deeply cynical mechanism. The sprawling chamber descended once more into an absolute profound stillness. She initiated her response. He respectfully allowed her to articulate her defense uninterrupted for approximately 40 seconds, and then, maintaining a remarkably quiet, carefully modulated tone that entirely avoided raising his volume, he stated, I must officially note for the permanent record of this committee that the representative has unfortunately not yet managed to provide any specific logical explanation regarding the fundamental contradiction between those two completely disparate applications of her stated principles. He smoothly advanced to yet another pristine page within his materials. I have one final area of inquiry before we transition to a broader examination of your actual legislative history. During the early months of last year, your legally mandated comprehensive annual financial disclosure. The documentation explicitly reported your overall household financial valuation at a level residing somewhere between several million and several tens of millions of dollars. The absolute verifiable baseline of that legally sworn document stands firmly at a multi-million-dollar valuation. Following the entirely predictable media scrutiny that accompanied the public release of that document, you proactively published a statement on a major digital broadcasting platform. I possess the exact text of that communication. You publicly declared, "I am barely worth a few $1,000s, let alone several million." He rested the final piece of evidence upon the desk. You did not attempt to provide nuance. You did not suggest that the accounting methods involved were highly complex. You definitively, forcefully asserted that you possessed a valuation barely reaching into the thousands. That represents a highly specific, absolute, factual claim, and it directly fundamentally contradicts the sworn contents of a binding legal document that you personally authenticated and officially submitted to the federal government. I raise this issue because the powerful narrative that you consistently broadcast to the public, the deeply compelling story of the resilient refugee, the child of marginalized circumstances, the inspirational woman who ascended from absolute poverty to forcefully advocate for citizens who continue to struggle with economic hardship. That specific narrative serves as the absolute foundational cornerstone of your entire political existence. That story is precisely why your constituents place their faith in your leadership. Yet, when the stark reality of a sworn financial document revealed a material reality profoundly divergent from the impression created by that deeply resonant narrative, your immediate response was to rapidly broadcast a deeply misleading public statement that directly contradicted your own legally binding disclosure. I am absolutely not utilizing my position to carelessly label you as dishonest. Rather, I am fulfilling my oversight responsibility by formally requesting that you comprehensively account for that specific documented discrepancy. The silence within the chamber became almost physically oppressive. She began to articulate her defense. He afforded her precisely the same uninterrupted 40-second window as before. And then, with identical quiet precision, he interjected. Administrative record that the representative has unfortunately failed to address the specific factual contradiction presented to her. She had been skillfully absorbing and neutralizing intense political hostility for many years. She had successfully navigated physical threats, unprecedented committee removals, and vicious partisan attacks. She possessed an incredibly rare talent for effectively converting toxic political aggression into high-octane campaign momentum. She was definitively not a defeated politician. However, the emotional momentum of the vast chamber had been steadily, undeniably shifting in the chairman's favor. For the better part of an hour, she possessed the profound situational awareness to recognize this reality. The veteran political journalists observing from the rear galleries were already mentally drafting a significantly different narrative than the predictable storyline they had anticipated. She possessed a highly potent strategic weapon. Carefully preserved since her introductory remarks, the chairman had publicly committed to providing a comprehensive explanation regarding his controversial travel choices, and he had yet to fulfill that obligation. That unfulfilled commitment represented an open door within his defensive architecture, and she was absolutely determined to forcefully march right through it. She purposefully leaned forward, adjusting her physical posture to project absolute authority. "Chairman," she began, her vocal tone incredibly precise and masterfully controlled, exhibiting the specific, undeniable intensity of an ISIS individual who has consciously recognized the critical inflection. "The point of the engagement, you explicitly promised during the opening moments of this very proceeding to provide this committee with a genuine, substantive explanation regarding your decisions to travel to luxury resorts during moments of profound crisis in your home region. I am officially holding you to that public commitment right now. We have spent nearly an hour of this committee's valuable time aggressively dissecting the minutiae of my historical public statements, all while actively ignoring the profound reality that you deliberately chose to vacation at a premium luxury resort, while hundreds of your own constituents were tragically perishing due to a catastrophic failure of basic heating and water infrastructure. Furthermore, you subsequently chose to travel internationally to tour ancient ruins, while vulnerable children were literally drowning in rising floodwaters back home. She locked her gaze directly onto him, entirely abandoning any semblance of political performance. Furthermore, you personally, deliberately inserted specific legislative language into a massive funding package that aggressively eliminated hundreds of millions of dollars in critical financial support for advanced meteorological research, the exact type of vital scientific research that serves to provide vulnerable communities with desperately needed early warning systems. Subsequently, those exact types of devastating weather events materialized, and numerous innocent lives were tragically lost. Therefore, before this committee proceeds any further with this highly aggressive line of inquiry, I am demanding the genuine, unvarnished explanation you promised right here, right now, on the permanent record. What exactly is your justification?" The collective posture of the room perceptibly shifted forward. She had successfully delivered the exact moment of high drama they craved. She knew with absolute certainty that the energy of the room was now deeply fractured, hovering precipitously on the edge. He understood this dynamic just as clearly as she did. The chairman regarded her steadily for a prolonged moment. "That is an entirely fair request, and I explicitly stated that I would address it," he replied evenly. He methodically moved his entire portfolio to the side, completely clearing the space in front of him. During the severe winter crisis, several years ago, my own children had been enduring freezing temperatures without basic utilities for multiple days. They earnestly requested to be transported to a location possessing functional infrastructure. As a parent, I made the deeply flawed decision to accompany them on a flight to a warmer destination. However, I immediately secured a return flight scheduled for the very next morning. The moment I fully comprehended the catastrophic widespread scope of the unfolding disaster, I was physically back on the ground in my home region. Within roughly 36 hours of my initial departure, I have publicly, repeatedly, and unequivocally stated on numerous occasions that my decision constituted a profound failure of personal judgment. I continue to stand by that severe self-assessment. He offered absolutely no rhetorical deflection, attempted no complex philosophical justification, and entirely avoided utilizing any defensive phrasing designed to minimize his culpability. He simply continued, "Regarding the flooding disaster, last summer, I was already engaged in long-scheduled international travel when the catastrophic weather began. My official communications team accurately reported that I initiated my return journey as rapidly as logistical realities permitted. I was photographed in the foreign capital the day after the disaster commenced. I acknowledge that the visual impact of that photograph is profoundly damaging. It appears damaging because the underlying reality is deeply damaging. Over 100 innocent individuals lost their lives tragically, including young children, I absolutely should have found a mechanism to return to my state significantly faster. He paused briefly. Concerning the specific legislative provision regarding meteorological funding, I executed a deliberate policy judgment that has subsequently been subjected to incredibly severe public criticism, and, considering the devastating events that later occurred, I fully acknowledge that such intense criticism is entirely fair and warranted. I have publicly stated as much on the record. He slowly pulled his portfolio back to the center of the desk. I fully own the entirety of those decisions. I am absolutely not requesting that you forgive them, nor am I suggesting that the public should ever forget them. They represent a permanent, unalterable component of my professional legacy, and they will rightfully follow me for the remainder of my career. That is the appropriate mechanism of accountability. He fixed his gaze upon her once more. However, I now wish to direct our attention back to an examination of your professional record. I do this not because one set of failures somehow magically cancels out another. Both of our respective records exist simultaneously in reality, and both represent entirely legitimate subjects for rigorous evaluation by this legislative committee. He smoothly turned to a completely fresh section of his documents. There exists a highly respected, fiercely nonpartisan organization dedicated to comprehensively tracking legislative activity. According to their meticulously compiled data, throughout your extensive multi-year tenure within, this institution you have formally sponsored or co-sponsored many hundreds of individual legislative proposals. My specific inquiry is remarkably straightforward. Precisely how many of those proposals have successfully navigated the legislative process to become enacted law? She began to formulate an explanation regarding the complexities of the process. He simply projected his voice over hers, not with aggressive volume, but with the specific, devastating precision of an attorney interrupting a witness, when the definitive answer is already securely established within. The evidence. The objective, verifiable number is precisely 3. And I believe it is incredibly important that we be exceptionally specific regarding the exact nature of those 3 successful legislative achievements. He elevated one finger. Legislative achievement number 1. A procedural bill officially designating a specific federal postal facility in your home district with an honorary title. This incredibly complex maneuver was successfully passed via a simple, uncontested voice vote. He elevated a second finger. Legislative achievement number 2. Another procedural bill officially designating a second federal postal facility in your home district with an honorary title. A second, purely ceremonial postal naming. He elevated a third finger. Legislative achievement number 3. A vital emergency funding mechanism designed to provide nutritional support for school-aged children during the height of the global health crisis. I wish to be exceptionally clear, this particular bill represents a genuinely significant, highly impactful legislative achievement. It successfully provided essential nourishment to millions of vulnerable young people, and it absolutely deserves to be fully recognized and commended for the profound good it accomplished. He slowly lowered his hand. 2 ceremonial postal designations and 1 emergency nutritional program that constitutes the absolute entirety of the statutory legislative record produced by an individual who has consistently and aggressively positioned herself as the single most essential, indispensable national voice regarding our highly complex foreign policy. An individual who has been granted expansive interviews by massive international broadcasting networks. An individual who was formally removed from the specific legislative committee that actually possesses institutional jurisdiction over the very international policies she discusses with such immense volume, and who has never successfully managed to regain her position on that critical panel. He observed her with an expression completely devoid of contempt, yet equally lacking in any discernible sympathy. You have spoken extensively throughout this very hearing regarding the vital importance of our national credibility. You have lectured this committee on what it truly means for the international community to process our leadership with appropriate seriousness. Therefore, I must ask you, when highly sophisticated foreign diplomats carefully analyze your sweeping public declarations regarding our geopolitical strategies, what exactly do they believe they are observing? Do they believe they are listening to the grounded, authoritative position of an influential legislator possessing genuine institutional power and a proven capability to enact complex policy? Or do they ultimately realize they are merely listening to the performative rhetoric of an individual who possesses exactly two ceremonial post offices and one emergency nutritional program to her name after nearly the decade of navigating the halls of Congress? Because I assure you, those represent two profoundly different realities, and I firmly believe that the vast, undeniable chasm between how you aggressively present your influence to the world and the actual objective reality of your institutional footprint, that chasm represents a profound question of fundamental credibility. She possessed a fully formulated, highly comprehensive response prepared for exactly this type of systemic critique. She was historically at her absolute most formidable when the political stakes were elevated to their maximum threshold. She masterfully articulated the profound philosophical, the difference between merely generating procedural legislative output and actually achieving paradigm-shifting political impact. She eloquently detailed the complex, arduous work required to successfully shift the boundaries of acceptable political discourse, aggressively highlighting the tens of millions of dollars in highly specific, deeply impactful community project funding she had successfully secured for the vulnerable populations within her home district. It was a remarkably strong, profoundly compelling defense, exactly the type of soaring inspirational rhetoric that her deeply committed supporters would enthusiastically share across digital platforms. The chairman listened to the entirety of her passionate defense with absolute unblinking stillness. When she concluded, he simply stated, "Throughout the duration of this morning's proceeding, you have aggressively and appropriately questioned my own professional credibility. I chose to answer every single one of those criticisms directly. I did not attempt to hide behind rhetorical deflection. I am now respectfully demanding that you answer my specific inquiries with that exact same level of directness. I am not asking you to contextualize the statements within a broader sociological framework. I am simply asking you to directly explain the characterization of a catastrophic attack as a specific action, the demonstrably false historical founding date of an organization, your highly unusual present vote regarding a massive historical tragedy, and the glaring contradiction regarding your financial declarations. Those represent your exact, deliberately chosen words. They are permanently etched into the public record. If you possess any genuine desire to address those specific contradictions directly, I am completely prepared to listen." She leveled her gaze firmly upon her interrogator. "I firmly believe that this particular committee proceeding has thoroughly concluded any semblance of useful or productive legislative work." She stated, her vocal delivery an absolute masterclass in emotional regulation. "I have willingly answered on your inquiries with absolute good faith. I genuinely look forward to continuing this vital conversation regarding our national priorities in future venues where the discourse can be conducted in a significantly more productive and intellectually honest manner." She methodically began the process of gathering her meticulously organized reference materials. The chairman observed her for an extended, deeply silent moment. "I possess absolutely no further questions for this particular witness." He calmly closed the covers of his slender portfolio, carefully positioned his writing instrument upon the desk surface, and deliberately chose not to elevate his line of sight again. The sprawling chamber descended into an incredibly profound quality of quietude. It was the heavy, deeply consequential silence of an environment that has just collectively witnessed an individual being presented with highly specific, profoundly difficult factual inquiries, and subsequently observing that individual choose to depart the premises without providing a specific factual answer to a single one of them. The chairman rose from his seat. He entirely ignored the arrayed broadcasting equipment. He calmly walked out of the chamber without ever casting a single glance backward. The representative's digital response was forcefully published exactly 4 minutes after she physically exited the committee chamber. The communication decried the hearing as an absolute demonstration of intense ideological prejudice, desperately masquerading as legitimate congressional oversight, highlighting the chairman's travel controversies. The digital communication generated an astounding 8 million views before she had even managed to successfully navigate the corridors back to her private congressional suite. By midnight, the appeal had successfully generated nearly $4 million in immediate financial contributions from fiercely loyal small-dollar supporters. The progressive media ecosystem enthusiastically fulfilled their anticipated role, looping the specific segment featuring her aggressive questioning regarding the chairman's travel controversies throughout the entire evening news cycle. A highly influential digital commentator forcefully declared that she had completely commanded the environment and thoroughly dismantled her opposition. By the arrival of the subsequent morning, her senior campaign management team circulated an internal memorandum bearing the remarkably confident subject line, "Excellent outcome. Our position remains incredibly strong." However, a completely different digital artifact was simultaneously circulating across the information ecosystem, operating on an entirely different timeline and driven by vastly different algorithms. It was precisely 41 seconds in duration. It featured absolutely no dramatic musical accompaniment. It simply featured the quiet, steady voice of the chairman meticulously reading 3 specific human names into the permanent historical record, Betty Father Michael Wells. The artifact concluded with precisely 4 seconds of the representative silently looking downward toward the polished table, her hands quietly folded within her lap. The surrounding committee chamber perfectly devastatingly still. This specific digital artifact did not initiate its massive viral spread through established political networks. Its initial dissemination occurred through digital communities, operated by emergency response professionals, municipal law enforcement personnel, and the surviving family members of the 12 victims. After the artifact had accumulated nearly 80 million views over the course of 3 days, a veteran political journalist, an individual who had previously authored profoundly sympathetic and glowing profiles regarding the representative's historic rise, sent a highly private communication to a trusted colleague. Through the inevitable mechanisms of the modern information ecosystem, that private message became widely public within 48 hours. I have professionally observed countless high-stakes legislative proceedings. What transpired today was fundamentally different. She arrived fully prepared to dominate the emotional volume of the room with a megaphone. He arrived methodically prepared with verified historical transcripts. You can temporarily outperform a transcript within the chaotic realm of social media, but it is absolutely impossible to permanently outperform a verified transcript in history. Shortly thereafter, a premier political publication released an incredibly detailed, exhaustive analysis spanning several thousand words. The focus of the piece was an exhaustive examination of the gap, a deeply researched, incredibly nuanced review of the representative's extensive legislative history. It painstakingly contrasted her minimal legislative output against her relentless, aggressive self-positioning as the single most indispensable voice regarding incredibly complex international diplomacy. It determined that there existed a profound, deeply systemic gap between the immense, towering scale of her carefully curated international public persona, and the incredibly modest, profoundly limited scale of her actual, tangible institutional footprint within the legislative body. On the exact same day that the monumental political analysis was published, four of her absolute closest ideological allies within the legislative chamber published absolutely nothing regarding the hearing. Not a single supportive word, when an investigative reporter transmitted a direct inquiry to a highly placed confidential source operating within one of those deeply silent offices, asking why the representative was entirely refraining from issuing any statement. The source immediately replied with a brief, devastating response. Certain individuals committed a specific action. The profound silence of presumed allies within the realm of high-level politics is never merely a neutral occurrence. It serves as a highly accurate, utterly devastating meteorological report regarding shifting political fortunes. The most profound blow, however, materialized in the form of a detailed editorial published within a deeply respected community-focused newspaper, printed primarily in the native language of her ancestral heritage, operating directly out of the vibrant, historically marginalized neighborhood that served as the absolute beating heart of her home district. The powerful editorial stated, "We have maintained immense, profound pride in our representative. However, we fundamentally owe one another absolute honesty. We sent her to the national capital because we maintained a profound belief that having a member of our own community stationed within those halls of power would inevitably result in something deeply concrete and highly beneficial materializing for our struggling neighborhoods. We are now respectfully asking not as her political adversaries, but as her foundational community. Representative, what exactly have nearly 10 years of national service tangibly produced for the people residing in this specific neighborhood?" A highly respected, fiercely nonpartisan public opinion research organization officially released the detailed findings from a comprehensive survey conducted directly within her specific congressional district. A specific question they had previously asked the exact same demographic sample merely 1 month prior was presented again. Do you genuinely believe the representative has accomplished enough during her extensive tenure to adequately address the highly specific economic and communal necessities of this particular district? Merely 4 weeks prior to the hearing, a robust, overwhelming majority of respondents had answered firmly in the affirmative. Just 2 weeks following the hearing, that affirmative response had plummeted by a staggering 20 percentage points. The senior statistical analyst astutely concluded that the sudden collapse was absolutely not due to the voters suddenly deciding she was fundamentally corrupt. Rather, a highly specific, meticulously documented, and publicly argued case had been forcefully presented for the very first time. That the massive gap between her towering national prominence and her surprisingly minimal local legislative record was a profound, verifiable reality deep within the confines of her official suite. Her incredibly experienced director of communications stated, employing a voice barely above a whisper. The next election cycle commences in exactly 13 months. On a bitterly cold morning in her home district, an elderly woman possessing the exact same cultural heritage as the representative carefully boards a public transit vehicle. This resilient woman has enthusiastically voted for the representative during every single campaign she has ever undertaken. She prominently displays a framed photograph upon the wall of her modest kitchen, capturing the historic inauguration ceremony years prior. However, during the previous week, this dedicated woman carefully read the deeply critical editorial published within her local community newspaper. She has spent considerable time deeply contemplating the contents of that article ever since, not with a sense of burning anger, but with the highly specific, quiet sorrow, characteristic of an individual who had invested immense belief in a beautiful ideal, and was now beginning to carefully ask herself whether the beautiful ideal and the stark reality had gradually, irreversibly drifted apart. As the vehicle travels along its route, she deeply ponders the central inquiry presented by the editorial. What exactly has nearly a decade of service tangibly produced specifically for us? She realizes with a profound sense of quiet clarity somewhere between her designated stops that she currently does not possess a satisfactory answer to that question. Furthermore, she recognizes that she has been patiently, quietly, waiting to receive that answer for a considerably long time. She, eventually, disembarks at her scheduled destination. The transit vehicle continues its relentless progression. The bustling city continues its endless motion, and the profound, unanswered question continues to endure alongside it, waiting in the tile, incredibly patient, entirely permanent manner, that truly profound, unanswered questions always wait. When she eventually steps privately into the voting booth and carefully examines the choices presented upon the ballot, she will undoubtedly remember the words of that local editorial. She will visualize the historic photograph displayed upon her wall. She will recall the agonizing moments of profound silence, and she will deeply ponder the fundamental question that remained tragically unaddressed. She will ultimately make her final democratic choice. She does not currently possess absolute certainty regarding what that ultimate choice will be, and that is the absolute devastating reality concerning profound unanswered questions. They fundamentally leave the final conclusion entirely unwritten.